Mark chapter 4, 35 to 41. As the evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat, with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" Then Jesus woke up. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence!" Good timing. "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord.
I'm going to suggest that everybody here has a storm theology. By that I mean, when a storm comes into your life, how do you respond? With God in mind, that's called a storm theology. What we believe when things seem to be going terribly wrong. When we pray during a storm, do we see God as a caring or uncaring God? Is he asleep or is he in control? More than most things, storms will reveal whether we live by faith or by fear, whether we live by trust or by doubt. Whether we like it or not, the way we react during a storm reveals a lot about ourselves. That's our storm theology. This is because storms really test us. Let me go into the background of this story. What have Jesus and the disciples been doing? The storm is about to happen, but it occurred at the end of a very busy day. It says as evening came, the darkness approaches, and an unexpected storm will soon be on them. But what have they been doing? Well, the day started back in Mark chapter 3, verse 20, where Jesus is ministering to large crowds. He has to go indoors so that he doesn't get overwhelmed, but then he's outdoors as well. And some scribes from Jerusalem come who say that he is possessed by Satan. We did this last week, remember? And that these come and say that his power is actually demonic. Oh, no wonder that he's feeling pretty drained. This was a very fierce and adrenaline-pumping confrontation for Jesus, for his disciples, and for the crowds, I'm sure. And then you will remember that his mother and brothers come along. They can't get to see him because of the crowds, but they send someone to talk to him, and they say to themselves, "He's gone nuts." The way he's responding to life now in the public ministry makes us believe that he's out of his mind. And so they come to collect him and bring him back to Jerusalem. They too would have been feeling the pressure. And so Jesus is under pressure not only from his opponents, but from his family, and of course the crowds are there. And so Jesus continues to teach and to minister for the whole of the day. And it says they're so busy that they didn't even get time to eat. However, for the disciples, they had a very front row seat to hear and to see the teaching about God's kingdom that Jesus was giving. And so their faith would have been stretched and grow. Who is this Jesus that gives such authority? Then they were tired and exhausted. So as evening came, Jesus suggested that they retreat to the other side of the lake to rest and to eat. There may be another reason that Jesus does that, and that's a teaching reason. It's a very strong possibility that these disciples face with being tested all the way along. It's one thing to follow Jesus when it's relatively easy. But what happens in the midst of a fierce storm? The disciples will soon find out. So what about the storm? Peter, James and John had been experienced fishermen. They knew about storms on the Sea of Galilee. And they were well aware what to do during the storm. You see, the Sea of Galilee was usually calm. Anyone been to the Sea of Galilee? I have. I've spent 6 or 7 weeks right in the area near the Sea of Galilee on the Jordan River at a kibbutz. And I saw the Sea of Galilee on a number of occasions, had a little swim there and all sorts of things. It's a beautiful lake, totally different to the Dead Sea, which is down the Rift Valley. But occasionally, because it's 200 metres below sea level and it's surrounded by quite high hills and valleys, strong winds can rush down and quickly whip up a terrifying storm. Verse 37 tells us that it was a fierce storm that came up. Now, the word Mark uses here is a very incredibly strong word. It's the word ferocious or violent. Matthew actually uses the word violent, where we get our word seismology from. You know what seismograph and all that sort of words? That comes from this word, meaning that the whole ocean was shaken, as in an earthquake. The storm was that violent it was shaking the whole sea. And who's been down at Currumbin Beach? I was down there a couple of years ago when Cyclone Debbie happened. And there were enormous waves coming in, and the whole of that little rock, Elephant Rock or whatever it's called there on Currumbin Beach, was surrounded with water, and one poor car had been caught in it, and it was being dragged up and down the beach and rolled around like it was a matchbox toy because of the wind and the waves. Verse 37 adds that the waves were breaking over the boat so that it was filling with water. Imagine the disciples' fear. Here they are, yikes, we're going to drown. The boat is sinking, we're in mortal danger. Now, of course, we've all had to face storms in life, whether they be loved relationships that have been broken, maybe a severe illness or a stroke, maybe cancer. Maybe someone's lost their job in a very surprising way that's caused financial hardship. Maybe a loved one has passed away who you deeply cared about. Or maybe a church family you've been a part of has been fractured by division, a lack of humility and conflict. These trials can come very suddenly, of course, and very traumatically. One phone call or a wrong step, and we can find ourselves in the midst of a very nasty storm. You see, that's the way of life. Ever since the fall, that has been part and parcel of living in God's world. God is not trying to trick us about that either. He's not trying to hide the hardships from us. Jesus said, didn't he, many times, but in John 16:33, for instance, here on earth you will have many trials, many sorrows. Storms of life will happen, that's part of life. But where is God, we ask? Why is he letting this happen? Does he really care for me? And of course that makes us wonder. What did the disciples do in the boat? What would you do? Well, first of all, their first concern about drowning was completely reasonable. These were professional fishermen, and this storm was so severe, so violent, that they didn't know how to handle it. They would have taken down the sails and they would have pulled in the oars and they would have been trying to head towards the waves and so on, but to no avail. This was so violent that they would believe they were going to drown. What's Jesus doing? Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? The boat is being severely tossed about in all directions by a huge and fierce storm The waves are crashing over the sides. It's filling up with water. The disciples are in panic mode. And what is Jesus doing? Well, he's asleep in the back of the boat on a cushion. You think to yourself, he must have been exhausted. He must have had an incredibly trying day that's left him exhausted to be asleep during the midst of this storm. And he seems to be able to sleep in the midst of this crisis. But does he know about it? What happened? The disciples run to Jesus and wake him up. Teacher, don't you care that if it goes on we're going to drown? That's a strange question, isn't it? The heat of the moment has overwhelmed them. They ask whether Jesus cares or not. Maybe it's because he's asleep that they think that. Of course, as we'll see, it's a major lesson for them and major lesson for us as we face storms when we ask that question. What the disciples didn't know is that this storm was being used by Jesus to teach them some key lessons about themselves and about him. It's one thing to believe something about God yourself in a church service when things are happy and rejoicing. It's yet another to believe about God and yourself when you are faced with a severe crisis. Jesus' reaction happens in verse 39. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, now I wonder if it's going to happen for me, Lord. Quiet! Be still! What an incredible, astonishing moment it was for the disciples. And you'll note that the way that he rebuked the wind may be an indication of what was behind the storm. That word rebuke, Jesus has only used against demons. Back in chapter 1 of Mark, we see that he's rebuked the demons back there. Maybe Mark, who wrote this story, wants us to realise that this storm is an attack by the kingdom of darkness to kill Jesus and his disciples. In Jewish thought, you see, the sea was often considered to be a very scary place, where storms rage and kill, where Leviathan lives. He lives in the seas and the oceans, and Satan in the Old Testament has used storms to kill, for instance, Job's servants and even Job's children. In the Psalms, it often speaks of the raging waves and the roaring seas causing great panic. It's possible then that this unexpected storm has come upon them in the middle of the sea as an attack from the devil himself in the darkness of night, or at least it's being used by Satan. Whether or not it's the devil or whether it's just a natural storm, the result is the same. Jesus commands, peace, be still, and immediately the storm obeyed. The wind died down and it was completely calm. Jesus to the rescue. Amen? The disciples are beginning to learn much more about who Jesus is because it stuns them. They had never seen anything amazing like this ever before. I think if we'd been in the boat, the same thing would have happened. Next time you're on a ferry or something and a few waves are about, stand up at the front and say, peace, be still, and see what happens. Probably nothing. Number 3. Jesus uses this to teach us about faith. Verses 40 and 41. So what happens? In verse 40 we read, then Jesus said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Wow. Their fear of drowning was quite natural. We would have been scared in the boat as well. Jesus' question about their faith versus their fear is not about their fear of drowning. The Lord's question is about their reaction to him in the midst of the storm. They've asked, "Teacher, don't you care about us?" They didn't think that Jesus cared about them, and they didn't trust that he did. So it's their understanding of who Jesus is that is off beam here. Instead of waking Jesus and trusting him to help, they questioned whether he cared for them. And of course, in life, this is a very big temptation of us all. When we face a storm, we're tempted to see God as less than he is, and we are tempted to doubt his love for us. And that's exactly what the devil wants us to do. And he uses storms in life to shake and upset our faith. But against this event has an excellent way for the disciples and for us today to learn more about who Jesus really is. Does he care? Of course he does. He's with us in the boat. And so the disciples' reaction in verse 41 is just incredible, amazing as well. They were more terrified of that. They were terrified and asked one another, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" They're learning, aren't they? We need to learn lessons like that. In the midst of our storms, Jesus is the one that controls the winds and the waves. All the aspects of our circumstances are in his hand. And it's great to remember that. Of course the disciples were stunned. I would have been stunned if I'd been on that boat too. It's the power of Jesus himself that says to us, "Do not fear." You know, that's the most often commanded phrase in all of Scripture. Don't be afraid. I am with you. So that even the wind and the waves obey him. So it's no longer a fear for their safety, it's more an awe about who Jesus is. Proverbs 1 verse 8 says, talking about wisdom, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Here the word fear means awe, wonder. The thought that, gee, this God is in control. That's the beginning of wisdom. Part 4 then, what should we learn and discern from this story? I think there are two things for us to learn. We will learn a lot about ourselves in the midst of storms. We will learn how to trust the Lord in them. So the first one is, circumstances mustn't fool us into not trusting God. The disciples were focused on the wind and the waves and the sinking boat. And that's quite normal and natural. If I'd been there, I would have adjusted the wind and the sails. I would have, if there had been, rowed towards the thing, we would have done everything that was practically and right to do as followers of God. But we mustn't let the circumstances keep us from trusting the Lord. And so, of course, in the midst of their concerns, they went to Jesus as their leader and they ran to him for help, and so should we. He wants to be with us in the midst of storms. And Jesus mildly rebukes them for not trusting his care, but he was there with them, in the same boat as them. Even though he was asleep, that didn't mean that his care or his concern had been lost. He trusted God with his own life in that boat, and so can we. It was Jesus who suggested that the boat trip in the first place so that they could be there in this. And he says these wonderful words, "Come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy laden. Come to me in the midst of your storms, and I will give you rest." Isn't that a lovely word? Goes on to talk about peace for our hearts and souls. Matthew 11:28. So we mustn't let circumstances bind us to God's love and care. Even in the worst storms, he is there and can be trusted by us to walk through them with us. That's the first one. Don't let circumstances fool you into not trusting God and his love for you. The second one is we always need a bigger picture. When Jesus rescued his disciples, we are witnessing God's sovereign power being released over the powers of darkness. The kingdom of darkness, which would inflict great storms on us, is being defeated by the kingdom of light, by Jesus' new creation entering into this old creation. This is Jesus' mission in the world, to transform the world so that we will have new heavens and new earth to live on for eternity, and to release us from the fears and the doubts and give us hope that this age is not the only age, and that the evil one has been defeated. You see, the biggest monsters in this world are sin and death and Satan. And the fears that we have often go along with them. But they are being defeated by Jesus, who is the stronger man, as we learnt last week. He is the King of kings, the Lord of lords. Jesus is so confident in God's care that he himself can be asleep while the storm rages in all its fury. He has the bigger picture in mind, a picture which will come to a head on the cross, which is his divine calling. There on the cross, the greatest fury and the biggest storm of ever, sin, evil, violence, will be meted out on him and be absorbed by him in his own body, so that he rescues us all from those, at least for the new creation. And at the resurrection, I'm sure the stunned disciples were left saying, "Who is this that even death and Satan can't hold him down?" The wind and the waves not only obey him, but death can't hold him down. What a wonderful thought. Our storms, when we feel afraid or out of control or deeply stressed, does it ever feel like Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat and unaware of you? It's not true. We may feel alone, but we never are. Cast all your cares upon him because he cares for you. Hold on to the promises. So when stress and fear comes, look to Jesus. He cares and he comes. If he seems far away, that's not true. He is walking there with you, as the poem Footprints reminds us. He is with us in the boat, in the storm. And he invites you to trust him daily, to trust his care, to trust his oversight of life, to live with the peace and hope that comes because he's control. And even the storms around you cannot shake that. So learn from your storms. God is teaching us all the time about him and about ourselves and about how to deal with the circumstances of life. You need to have a good storm theology, as it were. One that's been constantly refined, constantly improved, and constantly put into use. See the storms of life as an opportunity for God to display who he is as he is with you in them. Isn't that a good thought? Use the storms of life as an opportunity to grow in God and help him to display who he is to you. Learn from the storms of life. And God bless you in that, because it's not easy. And we're going to now have a word of prayer as Peter comes to us and prays for others. And then we're going to sing a beautiful old hymn that I'm sure you'll love. I haven't sung it for ages, but I so enjoyed doing it on Thursday night. So thanks, Peter.